Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. Penang in 1867 had been sitting on a powder keg for years. Georgetown might have been a British settlement with British laws, British officials, and the Union Jack flying above it. But beneath the surface, much of the island answered to a very different kind of authority. Two Chinese sworn brotherhoods dominated the streets. On one side stood the Gi Hin, by then a largely Cantonese and allied with the predominantly Muslim White Flag Society, and on the other, the mainly Hokkien Tuapek Kong Society, allied with the rival Red Flags. And these weren't simply street gangs. For thousands of Chinese immigrants arriving in the 19th century at the clan jetties, organizations like these provided something the colonial government largely couldn't. There was no welfare state, little police protection that an ordinary immigrant could necessarily rely on, and of course, no family waiting to help. You could arrive in Penang alone, unable to speak the local languages, with very little money, and no idea where your next meal was coming from. A brotherhood could change all of that. It could find you work. It could help you find somewhere to live. It could lend you money, introduce you to the right people, settle disputes, and of course, offer protection. In a strange country, it gave you something resembling a family. But families expect loyalty, and these families could enforce it. The societies became deeply entangled in labor, in gambling, opium, and the commercial networks generating fortunes through the Straits settlements. It would have also included prostitution. Their leaders were businessmen and power brokers, as much as secret society chiefs commanding money, influence, and when necessary, armed men. The Gi Hin Kongzi was one of the oldest and most powerful of them. It had probably existed in Penang since around 1790, making it almost as old as the British settlement itself. Its roots stretched back to the Heaven and Earth Society, part of a tradition of secret brotherhoods associated with the extraordinary ambition of overthrowing the Qing dynasty and restoring the Ming. But of course, when they transplant to Southeast Asia, those revolutionary ideals become rather more practical. Brotherhoods became multi-aid societies, labor networks, commercial organizations, and increasingly, instruments of power and social control. By the 1860s, the Penang Gi Hin was principally associated with the Cantonese community, and it was enormous. Contemporary estimates put its membership at somewhere around 20,000 men. Its great rival was the Tuapek Kong Society. These were predominantly Hokkien. It was led during the 1860s by one of the most formidable Chinese figures in Penang, Koo Thien Tek. The Tuapek Kong side appears to have been smaller than the Gi Hin, perhaps only around 9,000 men, but what it lacked in numbers, it more than made up for in commercial influence. And I think it's worth pausing on Koo, because he tells us something important about how power actually worked in Penang in the day. This wasn't some shadowy thug operating out of a back alley. Koo was part of Penang's commercial establishment, a Tauke, a Chinese leader dealing in immigrant labor, and of course, the enormously lucrative opium farms. He was also a founder of the Koo Kongzi, and a man who would go on to help found the Penang Chinese Town Hall. He led the Tuapek Kong Society throughout the 1860s, at the very height of its power, which also tells us just how blurred the line between respectable business and secret society power had become. So by 1867, two immensely powerful organizations faced one another across the streets of Georgetown. Between them, they could mobilize tens of thousands of men. They also had a lot of money. They had political connections, and they had weapons. Each also had allies outside the Chinese community. So the rivalry wasn't simply Cantonese against Hokkien, it was more about the money. So to understand why, you also have to understand one of the stranger ways the British financed colonial Penang, and they were called the revenue farms. Rather than the government officials collecting tax themselves, the colonial authorities auctioned certain monopolies to private businessmen. Effectively, pay the government enough money, and you could acquire the right to control and profit from a particular trade for a fixed period of time. And there were fewer trades more lucrative than opium. Thousands of Chinese laborers used it. Enormous sums of money passed through the trade, and the colonial government itself depended heavily upon the revenue it generated. Winning an opium farm, therefore, wasn't simply a matter of selling a profitable product. It brought wealth, influence, patronage, and with all of that comes power. And the rival Chinese commercial groupings fought bitterly for control of it. The Gi Hin and the Tuapek Kong Society became deeply, deeply entangled in this world, where legitimate commerce, colonial taxation, opium, gambling, and secret society influence overlapped in ways that would be almost impossible to separate. But then comes perhaps the most surprising part of the story: the red flags and the white flags. These were not Chinese societies at all. They were predominantly Malay Muslim organizations, with Indian members also appearing in contemporary accounts. And they had formed alliances with the two great Chinese brotherhoods, but on opposite sides. The red flags aligned themselves with the Hokkien Tuapek Kong Society, and the white flags allied themselves with the largely Cantonese Gi Hin, which means that the battle lines running through Georgetown in 1867 weren't Chinese against Malay, Muslim against non-Muslim, or even one immigrant community against another. They cut straight across them. These were cross-ethnic power blocks, effectively held together by neighborhoods, businesses, patronage, protection, personal loyalty, and of course shared interests. A Malay Muslim might therefore find himself fighting alongside a Hokkien Chinese against another Malay Muslim fighting alongside a Cantonese Chinese. You know, it's a really rare glimpse into 19th century Penang because it demolishes the convenient idea that colonial society consisted of separate Chinese, Malay, Indian, and European communities, quietly occupying their own little corners of the island. Reality was considerably messier. Money crossed those boundaries. Businesses crossed them, and of course, loyalties crossed them. And the other thing to remember about these societies is that they were armed. This wasn't a few men with sticks having a fight outside a coffee shop. The rival organizations had access to firearms and, remarkably, even artillery. When the violence finally exploded in 1867, parts of Georgetown would become an urban battlefield. So, how did it all begin? Well, it actually began with a single rambutan. One hot day in July 1867, on Pitt Street in Georgetown, a Chinese member of the Tuapek Kong Society was caught peering over the fence of a Malay man's house. The Malay was a member of the rival White Flag Society and understandably suspicious of the stranger looking into his compound, so he accused him of being a thief. Then someone threw a rambutan. And it sounds almost comical considering what followed, but the confrontation quickly escalated. The Chinese man returned with fellow members of the Tuapek Kong Society. The Malay man called upon his white flag friends, insults were exchanged, stones began to fly, and then clubs were raised. Then something much more serious happened. During the fighting, a stone struck and damaged the sacred signboard of the Tuapek Kong Society house. Suddenly, this was no longer a quarrel between two men. The signboard represented the honor of the society itself, and of course, damaging it transformed a street altercation into an insult that thousands of sworn brothers could be called upon to avenge. And within hours, firearms appeared. Attempts were made to negotiate a settlement, but the peace meeting failed, and the alliances began preparing for something much larger. Then, on the 3rd of August, 1867, the Tuapek Kong and the Red Flag Societies launched a coordinated attack against the Gihin and the White Flag Alliance. Georgetown descended into war. An estimated 35,000 men were drawn into the fighting, armed with muskets, spears, clubs, and they even dragged cannons from the merchant ships in the harbor and turned them on the streets of Georgetown. Houses were attacked and looted, buildings burned, and entire neighborhoods became contested territory. Even the harbor wasn't safe. Crews belonging to rival societies attacked one another aboard their junks. The violence then spread through the streets that we still walk through today. Pitt Street, Armenian Street, Beach Street, Cannon Street. And Cannon Street didn't acquire that name by accident. Artillery was used during the fighting around that area, leaving Georgetown with a street name that still carries the memory of those turbulent days. And I think what's perhaps even more revealing is how little the British could initially do about any of it. And this was supposedly their colony. Yet when tens of thousands of men belonging to rival societies mobilized, the colonial authorities discovered that their actual ability to control Georgetown was frighteningly limited. The lieutenant governor only had a small force of sepoys and police at his disposal. Government positions were barricaded and defended, while beyond them, parts of the town were effectively in the hands of these rival factions. And there's a particular reason why that force was so small. The island's regular garrison simply wasn't there. By sheer Murphy's bad luck, the troops who should have been positioned in Penang had been sent away only weeks before. The Madras Sepoy Regiment had been dispatched to the Nicobar Islands on a mission to rescue the widow of a ship's captain who was being held prisoner by a local chief, while the island's artillery battery had left for Burma. At the very moment Georgetown erupted, the soldiers and guns that might have ended this rising in a single afternoon were hundreds of miles away across the sea. It fell instead to one very new and very nervous man, Colonel Archibald Anson, the lieutenant governor who had taken up his post only in June, a matter of weeks earlier. And by his own admission, he barely knew the place. He had no one to turn to for advice and was unsure what to do. A newcomer, short of soldiers, facing tens of thousands of armed and organized men. And it's not hard to see how Georgetown slipped out of his hands. So for roughly 10 days, the fighting continued. Only after reinforcements arrived from Singapore was the government finally able to impose order. And by then, hundreds of men from both sides were dead. Homes and businesses had been destroyed, and one of Britain's most important settlements in the region had been given a rather uncomfortable lesson in who really possessed power on its streets. But order wasn't the end of the story. The government wanted to know exactly what had happened, and to make sure, I guess, it could effectively never happen again. An official commission of inquiry was convened. It worked through scores of witnesses, 71 of them by one account, and its report was laid before the Straits Settlements Legislative Council in 1868. There were reckonings for the men who had done the fighting too. Rioters were brought before the Penang courts that very September. 6 men were transported for 21 years. 4 more convicted of murder. Well, they were sentenced to death, though those sentences were later commuted to imprisonment. And each of the 2 great alliances was made to pay a very heavy fine. Money that went, with a certain irony, towards building the new police station and strengthening the very force that had just been so hopelessly overwhelmed. The authorities moved against the brotherhoods themselves as well. They couldn't not. Within 2 years came the Suppression of Dangerous Societies Ordinance of 1869, the beginning of a long campaign to bring the societies under control and, in the end, to outlaw them altogether. This episode actually became known as the Penang Riots of 1867, although it's actually acquired the wonderfully improbable nickname of the Rambutan Riots, because it was a rambutan that was thrown that started it all off. But of course, rambutan didn't really cause the deep-seated problems. The rivalry between these 2 clans had been building for years. There was money involved, particularly in opium and the revenue farms, as I mentioned. There were also commercial rivalries. There were ethnic loyalties, neighborhood disputes, competing systems of patronage, and of course, the 2 enormous networks of sworn men who had gradually accumulated enough power to challenge one another. So the rambutan was simply the match. The powder keg had been sitting there for years. And for 10 extraordinary days in 1867, it exploded in the middle of Georgetown. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.